Hello, my name is Natalie Hartwell. I'm 31 years old, and if you walked into my corner office on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower in downtown Portland, you'd probably think I was born into this life. Three mahogany desks line the expansive windows overlooking the Columbia River, each representing one of the companies I now own: Hartwell Construction, Pacific Logistics Solutions, and Riverside Real Estate Development. Combined, they generate over $15 million in annual revenue. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My assistant brings me coffee and fine china each morning at exactly 8:15. I drive a midnight blue Tesla Model S to work, park in my reserved spot, and spend my days making decisions that affect hundreds of employees across 3 states. I live in a restored Victorian mansion in the Pearl District, complete with original hardwood floors, a wraparound porch, and a garden that blooms with roses my housekeeper tends while I'm at the office. But here's what would shock you. Just 18 months ago, I was working double shifts at Rosie's All-Night Diner on the outskirts of Millbrook, a forgotten industrial town 3 hours east of here. I lived in a studio apartment above the local laundromat where the smell of detergent and fabric softener seeped through the floorboards, and the washing machines below shook my bed every night until midnight. My biggest financial decision was whether I could afford the name brand cereal or if I'd have to settle for the generic version again. The transformation didn't happen because I won the lottery, discovered some hidden talent, or married into wealth. It happened because of a man who spent most of my life treating me like I didn't exist, and a family that made sure I knew I'd never belong. It happened because of my grandfather, Theodore Hartwell, and a burial where his own children and grandchildren looked right through me as if I were invisible, until his lawyer stood up and read a letter that changed everything. You see, if you had attended that funeral at Millbrook Memorial Cemetery on a gray October morning, you would have seen exactly what I've experienced my entire life. The Hartwell family, dressed in their finest black suits and designer dresses, gathered around the mahogany casket like they were posing for a magazine spread. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones about Theodore's legacy, his business acumen, his generous spirit. And then there was me, standing 15 feet away from the rest of them, wearing a borrowed black dress from my coworker at the diner, clutching a wilted bouquet of gas station flowers because I couldn't afford anything from the real florist. Nobody spoke to me. Nobody acknowledged my presence. When Theodore's eldest son, my Uncle Reginald, delivered the eulogy, he mentioned every grandchild by name, except me. When they invited people to share memories afterward, and I took a tentative step forward, my Aunt Cordelia actually turned her back to me and started a conversation with someone else. I wasn't surprised. This was the story of my relationship with the Hartwell family since I was 7 years old. My mother, Rebecca, had been the black sheep. She'd fallen in love with a mechanic named Danny Sullivan, a man with calloused hands and a motorcycle who worked at the garage downtown. When she got pregnant with me and married him against the family's wishes, Theodore cut her off completely. No inheritance, no family business opportunities, no Sunday dinners at the big house on Elm Street. My dad died in a work accident when I was 12, and my mom passed from cancer when I was 22, leaving me completely alone. The Hartwells never reached out. Not when Dad died, not when Mom was in the hospital fighting for her life, not when I struggled through community college working 3 part-time jobs just to pay for textbooks. To them, I was Rebecca's mistake, a reminder of their daughter's poor judgment and an embarrassment to the family name. I only went to the funeral because something deep inside me needed closure. I needed to stand there one last time to say goodbye to the grandfather who never gave me a chance, and then walk away from the Hartwell legacy forever. I had no expectations. I wasn't even sure they'd let me stay for the entire service. But as Theodore's lawyer, a distinguished man named Mr. Pemberton, stepped forward with a sealed envelope in his hands, something in the air shifted. The conversations died down. The perfectly composed expressions on my cousins' faces began to change. And when he spoke my name, Ms. Natalie Hartwell Sullivan. For the first time in my life, every single person in that cemetery turned to look at me. What happened next turned my world upside down and revealed a truth about my grandfather that nobody, including me, saw coming. A truth that would transform me from the forgotten granddaughter serving coffee and pie to truckers at 2 a.m. to the woman sitting in this office today signing million-dollar contracts and employing half the people from my old hometown.
This is the story of how the man who ignored me my entire life secretly spent decades preparing to hand me an empire. How a family that treated me like dirt learned that their outcast had inherited everything they thought was rightfully theirs, and how I discovered that sometimes the people who seem the most distant are actually watching you the closest.
Because that letter didn't just make me rich. It revealed that my grandfather had been documenting every struggle, every small victory, every moment when I chose integrity over easy money, hard work over shortcuts. He'd been preparing me for this moment without me ever knowing it. And the 3 companies I now run aren't just businesses. They're the foundation of a legacy he built, not for the family members who surrounded him every Sunday, but for the granddaughter who proved her worth in diners and laundromats, far from the spotlight of family expectations. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how that letter changed everything, you need to know the whole story. You need to know about the years of rejection, the quiet observations, and the grandfather who loved me in a way I never recognized until it was too late to thank him for it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was last Tuesday evening when everything came rushing back. I was working late in my office, finalizing the quarterly reports for Pacific Logistics, when my assistant knocked and entered with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "This came by special courier," she said, placing it carefully on my desk. "The sender insisted it be delivered to you personally." I looked at the return address and felt my breath catch in my throat. Pemberton and Associates, Estate Law. My hands trembled slightly as I unwrapped the package, revealing a weathered, leather-bound journal with brass corners and my grandfather's initials, TH, embossed in fading gold letters on the cover. Inside the front cover, a handwritten note from Mr. Pemberton explained that this had been found in Theodore's personal safe with specific instructions to deliver it to me exactly 18 months after his passing. As I opened the journal, a loose photograph slipped out and fluttered to my desk. It was a picture I had never seen before. Me, at age 16, wearing my faded Millbrook High School uniform, walking out of the public library with an armload of business books. I was thin then, too thin, because we often chose between buying groceries and paying the electric bill. But in that photo, despite my worn sneakers and secondhand clothes, there was something in my posture, a determination, a focus that I had forgotten I once possessed. The sight of that photograph transported me instantly back to that October morning 18 months ago, standing at the edge of Millbrook Memorial Cemetery, watching a family that had never accepted me gather around the grave of a man I thought I never really knew. But more than that, it reminded me of the moment when everything I believed about my place in the world shattered completely. I had driven to Theodore's funeral in my beat-up Honda Civic, the one with the rattling exhaust pipe and the passenger door that only opened from the inside. I remember parking at the very back of the cemetery behind all the gleaming Mercedes and BMWs that belonged to my cousins and uncles. I had saved for 3 weeks to buy the black dress I wore, nothing fancy, just something appropriate from the discount rack at Macy's. And I carried those wilted gas station flowers because $27 for a proper funeral arrangement might as well have been $27,000. The morning was overcast, with thick gray clouds that threatened rain and a cold October wind that cut right through my thin coat. I stood apart from the family cluster, close enough to hear the service, but far enough away that I wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable with my presence. I watched my cousin Jared, Theodore's favorite, dressed in what looked like a $5,000 suit, checking his Rolex during the pastor's opening remarks. I saw my Aunt Lydia dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief, though I wondered if those tears were from grief or from thinking about how Theodore's wealth would now be divided among them. During the entire 40-minute service, not one person acknowledged me. When people filed past the casket to pay their final respects, they formed a neat line that somehow naturally flowed around me, as if I were invisible.
I had grown up experiencing this treatment at every family gathering I was reluctantly invited to, the Christmas dinners where I sat at the children's table even as an adult, the Easter brunches where conversations stopped when I approached, the birthday parties where I received generic cards while everyone else got thoughtful, expensive gifts. But this felt different. This felt final. Standing there in that cemetery, watching them mourn a man who built an empire while completely ignoring the granddaughter who struggled just to keep her lights on, I realized I was saying goodbye to more than just Theodore. I was saying goodbye to any hope I had ever harbored, however small, that I might someday belong to this family. I had planned to leave right after the burial, to drive back to Millbrook and return to my afternoon shift at the diner. I had already turned toward my car when I heard Mr. Pemberton clear his throat and call for everyone's attention. He was standing beside the casket with a sealed envelope in his hands, and something in his demeanor made everyone stop and turn back.
"Before we conclude today's service," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the cemetery, "Theodore Hartwell left specific instructions for me to read a letter aloud to the family." The murmur of conversation died completely. I paused halfway to my car, not sure if I should stay or go. After all, I wasn't really family in their eyes. But then Mr. Pemberton did something unexpected. His eyes scanned the crowd until they found me, standing alone by the cemetery gate. And he gestured for me to come closer. "Miss Sullivan," he called out, using my father's surname, "please join us. This concerns you as well." The look of surprise, and in some cases annoyance, that flashed across my relatives' faces was unmistakable. My Uncle Reginald actually took a step back, as if my proximity might somehow contaminate the proceedings. My cousin Amanda whispered something to her sister that made them both glance at me with barely concealed disdain. I walked back slowly, my heart pounding, still clutching those gas station flowers. I had no idea what was coming, but I knew that whatever Theodore had written in that letter was about to change everything. The wind picked up, scattering fallen leaves across the graves, and I remember thinking that this felt like the moment before a storm breaks, when the air goes still and electric, and you know something powerful is about to be unleashed. Mr. Pemberton broke the seal on the envelope with deliberate precision, and as he unfolded the letter inside, I caught a glimpse of Theodore's distinctive handwriting, the same careful script I remembered from the rare birthday cards he had sent when I was very young, before my mother's marriage had created the permanent rift that defined my childhood. Looking back now, sitting in this office surrounded by the fruits of an inheritance I never saw coming, I realized that photograph and that journal were more than just reminders of the past. They were evidence of something I never knew existed, a grandfather who had been watching, documenting, and preparing for a moment that would transform not just my life, but everything I thought I knew about family, worth, and love. To understand why that moment at the cemetery felt so monumental, you need to know the story of how I became the family outcast in the first place. It wasn't a single dramatic event, but rather a slow erosion that began when I was 7 years old, and my mother made the choice that would define the rest of my childhood. My mother, Rebecca Hartwell, had been the golden daughter before everything fell apart. She was beautiful, intelligent, and graduated summa cum laude from Whitmore University with a degree in business administration. Theodore had groomed her to eventually take over Hartwell Construction, and by all accounts, she was exceeding every expectation. She worked summers at the company offices, learned the business from the ground up, and even developed innovative cost-saving strategies that increased profits by 12% in her first year after graduation. But Rebecca had a rebellious streak that the Hartwell family never quite knew how to handle. She rode a motorcycle, wore leather jackets to family dinners, and refused to date the country club sons that Theodore and his wife, my grandmother Patricia, constantly pushed in her direction. She preferred dive bars to debutante balls, classic rock to classical music, and honest conversations to polite small talk. That's how she met Danny Sullivan, at Murphy's garage on the wrong side of Millbrook. Her motorcycle had broken down on a rainy Thursday evening, and Danny was the mechanic who stayed late to fix it. He was 26, with calloused hands, a quick smile, and an encyclopedic knowledge of engines that impressed even my mechanically minded mother. What started as gratitude for emergency roadside assistance turned into long conversations over coffee, then weekend rabs through the countryside, then something neither of them had planned on: love. Danny wasn't just different from the men Theodore wanted Rebecca to marry, he was everything the Hartwell family despised. He came from 3 generations of blue-collar workers, lived in a small apartment above the garage, and drove a 15-year-old pickup truck that he'd rebuilt himself. He had never set foot on a golf course, didn't own a suit, and thought stock portfolios were something other people worried about. But he made my mother laugh in a way that seemed to transform her entire being. And when she was with him, the rigid perfectionism that had defined her upbringing melted away. The family's disapproval was immediate and brutal. When Rebecca first brought Danny to Sunday dinner at Theodore's mansion on Elm Street, the temperature in the dining room seemed to drop 20 degrees. My grandmother made polite conversation while shooting looks of barely concealed horror. My Uncle Reginald asked Danny pointed questions about his career prospects and 5-year financial plan, with the kind of condescension that made it clear he already considered him completely unsuitable. Theodore himself said very little, but his silence carried more weight than any words could have. After dinner, I learned years later from overhearing a conversation between my mother and her sister Lydia, Theodore had taken Rebecca aside and delivered an ultimatum that would shape the rest of our family story. End this foolishness or face the consequences of choosing a life beneath your station. He wasn't just talking about social embarrassment or family disappointment. He meant financial consequences, professional consequences, and the complete severing of family ties.
But my mother was more stubborn than Theodore had calculated. Instead of ending her relationship with Danny, she doubled down. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Within a year, they were married in a small ceremony at the Millbrook Courthouse, with only Danny's family and a few of Rebecca's college friends in attendance. Theodore and Patricia didn't come. Neither did Reginald or Lydia or any of my cousins. The wedding photos show my parents looking happy, but somehow smaller, as if the absence of the Hartwell family had diminished the celebration itself. When my mother became pregnant with me 8 months later, Theodore's response was swift and final. He removed her from all business operations, canceled her trust fund, and made it clear that her inheritance was contingent on ending her marriage and returning to the family fold. When she refused, he followed through on his threat. Rebecca Hartwell Sullivan was effectively erased from the family business, the family finances, and eventually the family itself. I was born into this rift without understanding it. For the first few years of my life, we lived in a small 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, about 15 minutes from the mansion where my mother had grown up. Danny worked long hours at the garage to support us, often coming home with grease under his fingernails and exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes. My mother took a job as a bookkeeper for a local insurance company, work that paid a fraction of what she could have earned in the family business, but was steady enough to help us get by. Despite the estrangement, my mother never completely gave up hope that Theodore would eventually come around. She would drive past the Hartwell mansion sometimes when we went grocery shopping, slowing down as we passed the circular driveway and the perfectly manicured gardens. "Your grandfather lives there," she would tell me, pointing to the imposing colonial revival house with its white columns and black shutters. "Maybe someday you'll get to see inside." Those rare encounters with the Hartwell family during my early childhood were awkward, stilted affairs that left me feeling confused and somehow inadequate. We would occasionally run into Theodore at the hardware store or the post office, and he would nod politely at my mother while completely ignoring me. I remember tugging on my mother's sleeve once when I was 5, asking loudly, "Mommy, why won't the man look at me?" The embarrassment that flashed across her face taught me that there were questions I wasn't supposed to ask. The family dynamics became even more complicated when my cousins started appearing at local events. Jared and Amanda, Reginald's children, were close to my age but lived in a completely different world. They attended Millbrook Private Academy while I went to the public elementary school. They took piano lessons, tennis lessons, and sailing lessons, while I played in the backyard with toys from garage sales. When we encountered each other at the town's annual 4th of July festival or Christmas tree lighting, they would stare at me with the kind of curious detachment usually reserved for zoo animals. The worst part wasn't the open hostility. That would have been easier to understand and process. The worst part was the indifference, the way I was treated like a glitch in their perfect family narrative. I was Rebecca's daughter, the inconvenient reminder of her poor judgment, and acknowledging my existence would have required them to acknowledge that their golden daughter had chosen a life they considered beneath her station. When my father died in a workplace accident when I was 12, the silence from the Hartwell family was deafening. Danny had been crushed by a hydraulic lift that malfunctioned while he was working underneath a customer's car. The funeral was held at St. Mary's Catholic Church, the same church where my parents had been married, and it was packed with mechanics, neighbors, and friends from our working-class community. People brought casseroles, offered to help with yard work, and created a support network that carried my mother and I through those first devastating months. Not a single Hartwell attended the service. No flowers, no condolence card, no acknowledgement that Rebecca had lost the love of her life and I had lost my father. It was as if Danny's death was just another consequence of my mother's poor choices, something that didn't warrant their attention or sympathy. That's when I began to understand that I would never be a real part of the Hartwell family. I wasn't just excluded from their wealth and privilege, I was excluded from their basic human compassion. They had written off my mother when she married beneath her station, and by extension, they had written off me before I was even old enough to understand what that meant. Despite the years of silence and rejection, Theodore Hartwell was impossible to ignore in a town like Millbrook. He wasn't just my estranged grandfather. He was the man whose name appeared on half the buildings in town, whose business decisions affected nearly every family, and whose presence commanded attention wherever he went. Growing up in his shadow while being excluded from his world created a strange, complicated relationship that I spent years trying to understand. Theodore wasn't the warm, cookie-baking grandfather you see in movies. He was 72 years old when my father died, with steel gray hair that he kept perfectly groomed, piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through any pretense, and a bearing that suggested he'd never had a moment of self-doubt in his life. He stood 6 feet tall even in his 70s, wore impeccably tailored suits to every public appearance, and spoke with the kind of authority that made grown men reconsider their opinions mid-sentence.
In Millbrook, Theodore was both respected and feared. Hartwell Construction had built most of the commercial buildings in the downtown area, including the new library, the community center, and the medical complex that employed half the town's residents. Pacific Logistics Solutions, his transportation company, moved goods through 3 states and provided steady employment for dozens of truck drivers and warehouse workers. Riverside Real Estate Development had transformed the waterfront district from a collection of abandoned warehouses into a thriving area of shops, restaurants, and luxury condominiums. But what made Theodore truly formidable wasn't just his wealth. It was his reputation for absolute integrity and ruthless business acumen. He never made promises he couldn't keep, never signed contracts he hadn't read 3 times, and never tolerated incompetence or dishonesty from anyone in his employ. Stories circulated around town about Theodore firing longtime employees for padding their expense accounts or terminating partnerships with suppliers who tried to cut corners on quality. He demanded excellence, and those who couldn't deliver simply didn't last in his orbit. This was the man who had cut my mother out of his life for choosing love over status. And yet I found myself oddly fascinated by him during my teenage years. Maybe it was because he represented everything I couldn't have, or maybe it was because I recognized something of my mother's stubborn determination in his unwavering principles. Whatever the reason, I began paying attention to Theodore in ways that probably weren't healthy for a girl who would never be acknowledged as his granddaughter. I started reading the business section of the Millbrook Gazette, following the quarterly reports on his companies, and learning about expansion plans and profit margins. When he gave speeches at the Chamber of Commerce or appeared at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, I would sometimes stand at the back of the crowd, watching how he commanded attention without ever raising his voice. He had a way of making complex business concepts sound simple and compelling, and even people who disagreed with his politics seemed to respect his business judgment. The strange thing was that occasionally, during these public appearances, I would catch him looking in my direction. It was never obvious, never a direct stare, but there would be a moment when his eyes would sweep across the crowd and pause, just briefly, when they reached where I was standing. I told myself I was imagining it, that he probably didn't even recognize me after all these years, but those glances felt deliberate in a way that made my heart race. When I turned 16 and started working part-time at Henderson's bookstore while attending high school, those encounters became more frequent and more puzzling. Theodore was a regular customer, arriving every other Wednesday to purchase business journals, historical biographies, and occasionally classic literature. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly owner, treated him with the kind of deference usually reserved for visiting dignitaries, and he was always polite but efficient in his transactions. But I noticed that on Wednesdays when I was working, Theodore would linger longer than usual. He would browse the business section where I was often restocking shelves, and though he never spoke to me directly, he seemed to be observing my work habits. When I organized the finance books by publication date rather than alphabetically, he nodded approvingly. When I recommended a book on supply chain management to another customer, he stood close enough to overhear the entire conversation. The most unnerving incident happened during my senior year of high school. I was working alone on a quiet Thursday evening when Theodore entered the store just as I was preparing to close. Mrs. Henderson had left early for a doctor's appointment, and I was supposed to lock up and deposit the day's receipts in the night deposit slot at the bank across the street. "I need to purchase this," Theodore said, placing a thick volume about business ethics on the counter. His voice was exactly as I remembered from the rare occasions when I had heard him speak when I was younger, deep, measured, and completely self-assured. I rang up the sale with trembling hands, acutely aware that this was the first time we'd been alone together since I was a small child. He paid with exact change, which seemed typical of his precise nature, and I handed him the receipt and the book wrapped in the store's brown paper. "You're Rebecca's daughter," he said suddenly, and it wasn't a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. He continued, studying my face with those penetrating blue eyes. "You have her intelligence, but you also have something she never learned: patience." Before I could respond, he turned and walked out of the store, leaving me standing behind the counter with my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. It was the longest conversation I'd ever had with my grandfather, and it left me more confused than ever about what he thought of me or why he had chosen that moment to acknowledge my existence. That encounter changed something fundamental in my relationship with Theodore. Even though we remained strangers in every practical sense, I began to understand that he had been watching me, evaluating me, perhaps even testing me in ways I didn't fully comprehend. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying, because it suggested that despite the official family estrangement, I had somehow earned a place in his awareness. Over the following months, as I prepared for graduation and college applications, I found myself unconsciously working harder, as if Theodore might be observing my choices and judging my character. When other students at Millbrook High were skipping classes and treating senior year as an extended vacation, I maintained perfect attendance and continued working at the bookstore to save money for college expenses. When classmates cheated on exams or plagiarized papers, I completed every assignment with meticulous attention to detail. I told myself I was doing these things for my own future, not to impress a grandfather who had disowned my mother and ignored me for most of my life. But deep down, I knew that Theodore's unexpected acknowledgement had awakened something in me.
a desire to prove that I was worthy of the Hartwell name, even if I would never be permitted to claim it. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was working so hard to gain the approval of a man who had caused my mother so much pain. But Theodore represented more than just family acceptance. He represented a standard of excellence, a level of achievement that seemed both impossible and irresistible. He had built an empire through sheer force of will and intelligence, and despite everything that had happened between our families, I found myself wanting to prove that I had inherited some small portion of that drive and capability. What I didn't understand then was that Theodore had been conducting his own evaluation, documenting my choices and character in ways that would eventually reshape both our destinies. He wasn't just observing me from a distance, he was preparing for something that would transform my life in ways I never could have imagined. After graduating high school, I enrolled at Millbrook Community College with a partial academic scholarship and a determination to prove myself worthy of something I couldn't quite name. My mother had been battling cancer for 2 years by then, and the medical bills were mounting faster than our insurance could cover them. Between her reduced hours at the insurance company and my part-time wages from the bookstore, we were barely keeping our heads above water financially. That's when Theodore began what I now understand was a carefully orchestrated series of tests, though at the time they felt like a combination of coincidences and small miracles that kept us from losing everything. The first incident happened 3 weeks into my freshman year. I was working a double shift at the bookstore on a Saturday, trying to earn extra money for my mother's prescription medications, when Mrs. Henderson received a phone call that left her visibly shaken. Her voice was tight with worry as she hung up and turned to me. "Natalie, I'm going to have to let you go," she said, tears forming in her eyes. "The landlord is raising my rent by 40% next month. I can't afford to keep the store open and pay an employee." My heart sank. That job wasn't just income. It was my only real work experience, and I needed every dollar to help cover our mounting expenses. I nodded numbly, understanding that Mrs. Henderson was facing her own financial crisis, but internally I was calculating how many meals we'd have to skip to make up for the lost wages. 2 days later, Mrs. Henderson called me with news that seemed too good to be true. An anonymous benefactor had offered to cover the rent increase for the next 2 years with the stipulation that the bookstore maintain its current staffing levels and hours. She could keep me on, and I could continue working the 20 hours per week that had become essential to our survival. "Did they say why?" I asked, though I was already suspicious about the timing and the specific conditions. "They said they valued having a quality bookstore in downtown Millbrook and wanted to ensure it remained a community resource. The lawyer who handled the arrangement mentioned that the benefactor had observed the store's excellent customer service and wanted to support that standard." I had no proof, but something about that phrasing, "observed the store's excellent customer service," made me wonder if Theodore had been watching more closely than I realized. The anonymous arrangement allowed me to continue working while maintaining the fiction that I was succeeding entirely on my own merit. The pattern continued throughout my 2 years at community college. When my mother's cancer treatments required her to take extended leave from work, our health insurance somehow approved experimental therapies that were usually denied. When I needed textbooks that cost more than our monthly grocery budget, I would find them marked down to impossibly low prices at the campus bookstore, often with notes saying they were returned items being sold at cost. Most significantly, when I applied to transfer to Whitmore University for my junior year to complete my business degree, I received a notification about a scholarship I had never heard of, the Millbrook Community Excellence Award. It covered full tuition, housing, and even provided a modest living stipend. The scholarship committee consisted of local business leaders whose names I didn't recognize, and the criteria seemed perfectly tailored to my specific circumstances. Academic achievement despite financial hardship, demonstrated work ethic, and commitment to community service. I should have been suspicious about how perfectly everything was falling into place, but I was too focused on keeping up with the demands of school and work while helping care for my increasingly ill mother. If someone was pulling strings behind the scenes, I told myself at least they were giving me opportunities to prove myself rather than simply handing me charity.
At Whitmore, the challenges intensified in ways that pushed me harder than I had ever been pushed before. The business program was notoriously demanding, with professors who seemed determined to weed out students who weren't completely committed. My classmates came from wealthy families and had attended prestigious prep schools that had prepared them for this level of academic rigor. I was the scholarship kid from the community college, working 25 hours per week at the campus library to maintain my financial aid eligibility. But instead of feeling defeated by the competition, I found myself energized by it. When other students complained about Professor Williamson's impossibly difficult corporate finance exams, I spent extra hours in the library mastering every concept until I could solve problems in my sleep. When the advanced marketing course required a semester-long project developing a complete business plan, I chose to analyze the logistics industry, partly because Theodore's Pacific Logistics Solutions provided a model I could study, and partly because I wanted to understand how businesses like his actually operated. The more I learned about corporate strategies, supply chain management, and financial planning, the more I began to appreciate the complexity of what Theodore had built. His 3 companies weren't just profitable enterprises. They were interconnected systems that supported each other and created value in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Hartwell Construction provided infrastructure projects that required Pacific Logistics transportation services, which in turn created demand for warehouse and office space developed by Riverside Real Estate. It was an elegant business ecosystem that demonstrated both vision and execution. My professors began to notice my work, particularly Professor Chen in the strategic management course. She was a former McKinsey consultant who had returned to academia after 20 years in corporate consulting, and she had a reputation for brutal honesty about students' potential. When she asked me to stay after class one day during my senior year, I prepared myself for criticism about my latest case study analysis. Instead, she offered me something unexpected. Natalie, have you considered applying for our graduate program? Your work demonstrates the kind of analytical thinking we look for in our MBA candidates. The suggestion was flattering but impractical. Even with my undergraduate scholarship, I was accumulating student loans to cover living expenses, and my mother's medical bills continued to mount despite her insurance coverage. A graduate degree would mean 2 more years of accumulating debt with no guarantee of employment that would justify the investment. I appreciate the suggestion, Professor Chen, but I need to start working full-time after graduation. I have family obligations that require immediate income. She nodded understandingly, but then surprised me again. There might be options you haven't considered. Several local businesses sponsor graduate students who commit to working for them after completion of their degrees. Would you be interested in learning more about those opportunities? 2 weeks later, I received a letter from a legal firm I had never heard of, Morrison, Blackwell & Associates. They represented an unnamed local business that was interested in sponsoring a graduate student in the Whitmore MBA program, with full tuition coverage and a generous monthly stipend. In exchange, the sponsored student would commit to a 3-year employment contract with the sponsoring company upon graduation. The arrangement seemed almost too good to be true, but the legal documentation was thorough and professional. The sponsoring company was described only as a diversified business enterprise with operations in construction, logistics, and real estate development. The position being offered was management trainee with advancement opportunities based on performance and demonstrated leadership capability. I should have recognized the description immediately, but I was so focused on the financial relief the arrangement would provide that I didn't connect the dots until much later. I signed the agreement and entered the MBA program, telling myself that I had earned this opportunity through hard work and academic excellence. The graduate program pushed me even harder than my undergraduate studies.
Between coursework, case competitions, and a part-time internship at a regional consulting firm, I was working 60 hours a week and sleeping 4 hours per night. But instead of burning out, I discovered reserves of energy and focus that I didn't know I possessed. When other students struggled with quantitative analysis, I thrived. When case studies required creative problem solving under pressure, I found myself naturally taking leadership roles in group projects. Most importantly, I began to understand not just how businesses operated, but why some succeeded while others failed. The companies that lasted were the ones that created real value, treated their employees and customers with respect, and maintained the highest standards of integrity, even when shortcuts would have been easier and more profitable. It was exactly the kind of business philosophy that Theodore had built his empire on, though I didn't fully appreciate the connection until much later. I was unconsciously absorbing the principles that would eventually make me worthy of inheriting his life's work, never suspecting that every opportunity, every challenge, and every test had been carefully orchestrated by the grandfather who had seemingly ignored me my entire life. The breaking point came during my second year of the MBA program, on a cold February morning when everything I thought I understood about my life came crashing down around me. My mother had been losing her battle with cancer for months, and I had been commuting between Whitmore and Millbrook every weekend to spend time with her and help manage her care. The doctors had stopped talking about treatment options and started using words like comfort and quality of life remaining. I was sitting in advanced corporate strategy when my phone buzzed with a call from Millbrook General Hospital. Professor Martinez was in the middle of explaining hostile takeover defenses when I saw the number on my screen and felt my blood turn to ice. I slipped out of the classroom and answered in the hallway, my hands trembling as I pressed the phone to my ear. "Miss Sullivan, this is Dr. Patel. I'm afraid your mother has taken a turn for the worse. You should come to the hospital as soon as possible." The 2-hour drive from Whitmore to Millbrook passed in a blur of panic and desperate prayers. When I arrived at the hospital, my mother was unconscious, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical determination. Dr. Patel explained that her kidneys were failing, her liver function was deteriorating, and the cancer had spread to her brain. She had maybe days left, possibly hours. I held her hand for 3 days straight, sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair and leaving only when the nurses insisted I eat something or use the restroom. On the third night, she squeezed my fingers weakly and opened her eyes for what would be the last time. "Natalie," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the ventilator. "I'm proud of you. Your father would be proud too." She died 2 hours later, leaving me completely alone in the world at 24 years old. The funeral arrangements fell to me, and I quickly discovered how expensive death could be. Even the most basic service cost more than I had in my checking account, and the funeral home required payment up front. I called my academic advisor to explain that I would need to withdraw from the semester to handle my mother's affairs and find full-time work to pay off the medical bills and funeral expenses. That's when the anonymous sponsorship that had seemed like such a blessing revealed its true nature. According to the contract I had signed, withdrawing from the MBA program for any reason other than documented medical disability would trigger immediate repayment of all tuition and stipend money received, a sum that totaled nearly $80,000. Money I didn't have and couldn't possibly repay. I sat in my empty childhood home, surrounded by boxes of my mother's belongings and stacks of unpaid medical bills, reading the contract terms with growing desperation. The legal language was clear and unforgiving. If I couldn't complete the program and fulfill the 3-year employment commitment, I would be liable for immediate repayment with interest and penalties. The total amount would bankrupt me and destroy any chance of financial recovery. But staying in school seemed equally impossible. How could I focus on case studies and corporate finance when I was drowning in grief and debt? How could I maintain the academic performance required by my scholarship when I couldn't afford to eat regularly or keep the electricity turned on in my mother's house? That's when I made a decision that would haunt me for months afterward. I decided to find out who my anonymous sponsor really was and ask them for mercy, for some kind of payment plan or modified arrangement that would allow me to complete my education without losing everything. The law firm that handled the sponsorship agreement was surprisingly unhelpful. Morrison, Blackwell, and Associates claimed attorney-client privilege prevented them from revealing their client's identity, even though I was the beneficiary of the arrangement. But I had learned something about research and investigation during my business studies, and I wasn't going to give up that easily. I spent 2 weeks digging through public records, corporate filings, and business directories. Morrison, Blackwell, and Associates had handled numerous transactions for Theodore's companies over the years. The scholarship I had received was funded through a shell corporation called Millbrook Educational Trust, which had been established by another shell corporation called Heritage Holdings, which was ultimately owned by Hartwell Enterprises. Theodore had been my anonymous sponsor all along. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Every opportunity I thought I had earned through my own merit, every scholarship and intervention that had kept me afloat, every carefully orchestrated coincidence that had shaped my path, it had all been Theodore pulling strings behind the scenes. I hadn't proven myself worthy of anything. I had been a charity case, a project, a way for my grandfather to assuage whatever guilt he felt about cutting off his daughter and granddaughter. The anger that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just rage at Theodore for manipulating my life without my knowledge or consent. It was fury at myself for being naive enough to believe that someone like me could succeed in his world through hard work alone. It was humiliation at the thought of all the professors and classmates who probably knew about my situation and saw me as the poor girl being propped up by family money. I drove to Theodore's mansion on Elm Street on a rainy Thursday evening, my hands shaking with anger as I rang the doorbell. When he answered, dressed in a burgundy smoking jacket and looking completely unsurprised to see me, I unleashed years of pent-up frustration and hurt. "How dare you?" I said, my voice breaking with emotion. "How dare you manipulate my entire life and then pretend I earned any of it?" He stepped aside to let me into the foyer, his expression calm and measured. "Would you like some tea, coffee? You look like you haven't been sleeping."
His casual tone only made me angrier. "I don't want anything from you. I want you to know that I'm done being your puppet. I'm withdrawing from school, I'll find a way to pay back your money, and I never want to see you again." Theodore nodded slowly, as if my outburst was exactly what he had been expecting. "And how do you plan to repay $80,000 while working at a diner? Because that's where you'll end up, without your degree, without references, without the connections you've been building. You'll be serving coffee to truckers for the rest of your life." "Better that than living a lie," I shot back. "At least I'll know I earned it honestly." "Earned what honestly?" Theodore asked, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Poverty? Mediocrity? The same limited life your father accepted because he was too proud to take help when it was offered?" The mention of my father was the final straw. "Don't you dare talk about my father. He was worth 10 of you. At least he knew how to love someone without trying to control them." Theodore's expression darkened, and for the first time in my life, I saw genuine anger flash in his eyes. "Love? You think what I've done isn't love? I've spent 6 years creating opportunities for you, opening doors, making sure you had every chance to succeed. I've invested more time and money in your future than I ever invested in my own children's education." "But you never asked me what I wanted," I said,
tears streaming down my face. "You never ask if I wanted your help or your money or your carefully planned future. You just decided what was best for me and manipulated everything to make it happen. Because you were too young and too stubborn to make good decisions on your own. Just like your mother was. Just like she chose a garage mechanic over a business empire. And look where it got her. Dead at 47, with nothing to show for her life but medical debt and a daughter who thinks pride is more important than practical success." The words hit me like physical blows, each one designed to wound and diminish. In that moment, I understood why my mother had chosen to walk away from all of this. The money and opportunities came with strings attached, and those strings would always be held by a man who believed love was something you imposed on people rather than something you offered freely. "You're right about one thing," I said, wiping my eyes and straightening my shoulders. "I am stubborn, and I'm stubborn enough to make my own mistakes rather than live someone else's version of my life." I walked out of that mansion and never looked back. Or at least, I told myself I never would. I withdrew from the MBA program the next morning, packed my mother's belongings into storage, and moved back to Millbrook to work at Rosie's all-night diner. The $80,000 debt hung over me like a sword, but I convinced myself that financial ruin was better than emotional manipulation. What I didn't understand then was that Theodore had been preparing for this moment too, that my rebellion, my anger, my stubborn insistence on independence were all part of a test I didn't even know I was taking. And that walking away from him that night was not the end of our story. It was the beginning of the most important lesson he would ever teach me about the difference between earned success and inherited privilege. The next 18 months were the hardest of my life, and not just because of the financial pressure. Working at Rosie's all-night diner meant 12-hour shifts on my feet, serving coffee and pie to long-haul truckers, factory workers getting off the graveyard shift, and insomniacs looking for a place to sit when the rest of the world was asleep. The work was honest, but exhausting, and the tips barely covered my rent on that studio apartment above the laundromat. But the real struggle was psychological. Every morning when I woke up to the sound of washing machines churning below me, I was reminded of how far I had fallen from the trajectory Theodore had mapped out for my life. My former classmates from Whitmore were graduating with their MBAs, taking jobs at consulting firms and Fortune 500 companies, while I was memorizing the difference between hash browns and home fries for the breakfast crowd. The debt collection notices started arriving 3 months after I left school. Morrison, Blackwell & Associates had turned my case over to a collection agency, and they weren't interested in my explanations about moral objections to manipulative family members. They wanted their $80,000 plus accumulated interest and penalties, and they had legal remedies at their disposal if I couldn't pay. I tried to negotiate payment plans, offering to send whatever I could afford each month, but the amounts were laughably inadequate. After paying rent, utilities, food, and my mother's remaining medical bills, I had maybe $200 left each month. At that rate, I would be paying off Theodore's investment in my education for the rest of my natural life. The legal threats escalated gradually. First came certified letters demanding immediate payment, then notices of intent to garnish wages. Finally, a summons to appear in court for a judgment hearing. I couldn't afford a lawyer, so I represented myself, standing before a judge and explaining why I couldn't repay money that had been given to me without my knowledge or consent.
The judge was sympathetic but clear about the law. I had signed a contract, received valuable consideration, and failed to fulfill my obligations. The debt was valid, regardless of my personal feelings about how it had been arranged. He granted the collection agency permission to garnish 25% of my wages until the debt was satisfied. 25% of a diner waitress's income was devastating. I had to choose between keeping my apartment and eating regularly. Some weeks I survived on the free meal that Rosie provided to employees during their shifts, plus whatever crackers and peanut butter I could afford from the dollar store. I lost weight, developed chronic headaches from stress and poor nutrition, and stopped sleeping through the night because anxiety would wake me at 3 in the morning with a racing heart and sweaty palms. The worst part wasn't the physical hardship, though that was genuinely difficult. The worst part was the isolation and the constant reminder that Theodore had been right about what would happen if I chose pride over pragmatism. Every bill I couldn't pay, every opportunity I couldn't afford to pursue, every moment when I felt trapped by circumstances beyond my control proved his point about the consequences of rejecting help when it was offered. I stopped reading business news because it reminded me of the career I had abandoned. I avoided the parts of Millbrook where I might encounter former classmates or professors who might ask what had happened to my promising academic trajectory. I became a ghost in my own hometown, invisible except to the customers who needed coffee refills and the landlord who collected rent. But Theodore's presence in Millbrook made complete avoidance impossible. His companies were everywhere, their logos on construction sites and delivery trucks, their buildings dominating the downtown skyline. Pacific Logistics trucks drove past the diner daily, and I would watch them through the window while wiping down tables, wondering if the drivers knew that their boss's estranged granddaughter was cleaning up their coffee spills. The psychological pressure intensified when I learned from casual conversation at the diner that Theodore's health was declining. Customers would mention seeing him at the doctor's office more frequently, walking more slowly, looking frailer than the commanding presence I remembered. Part of me wanted to reach out, to attempt some kind of reconciliation before it was too late, but my pride and hurt feelings made that impossible. I told myself that if he wanted to repair our relationship, he could make the first move. He was the one with the power, the money, the ability to forgive the debt that was crushing me. If he genuinely cared about me rather than just wanting to control me, he would find a way to help without strings attached. But months passed without any communication from Theodore or his representatives. The garnishment continued, the bills kept coming, and I began to accept that this grinding existence might be permanent. I had chosen my principles over my comfort, and these were the consequences I would have to live with. The news of Theodore's death reached me through the breakfast crowd at the diner on a Tuesday morning in October. One of the regular customers, an elderly man named Frank who worked part-time at the hardware store, mentioned it casually while I was refilling his coffee. "Did you hear old Theodore Hartwell passed away yesterday?" he said, not knowing about my connection to the family. "Heart attack, I think. Found him in his study at home." I managed to finish my shift that day, but barely. My hands shook as I served customers, and I spilled coffee twice because I couldn't concentrate on simple tasks. When my replacement arrived for the evening shift, I drove to the cemetery and sat in my car outside the gates, staring at the place where Theodore would soon be buried. The emotions that hit me were more complicated than simple grief. There was sadness for the loss of a man who had shaped my life in profound ways, even when that shaping felt manipulative and controlling. There was regret for all the conversations we would never have, all the opportunities for understanding that had been lost to pride and stubbornness on both sides. But there was also a strange sense of relief. Theodore's death meant that the debt might be forgiven or forgotten, that the legal pressure crushing me might finally ease. It meant that I could stop looking over my shoulder for signs of his influence in my life, stop wondering if random opportunities or obstacles were secretly orchestrated by him. Most painfully, there was guilt for feeling relieved about anyone's death, even someone who had caused me such anguish. Theodore had been my grandfather, whatever else had passed between us, and his death made me officially alone in the world, in a way that felt both terrifying and liberating. I didn't plan to attend the funeral initially. What would be the point? The family had never acknowledged me as one of them, and showing up at Theodore's burial would only create awkwardness for everyone involved. I had no claim to grief that anyone would recognize or respect. But as the day of the service approached, I found myself unable to stay away. I needed some kind of closure, some way to mark the end of the relationship that had defined my adult life, even when I was fighting against it. I needed to stand at his grave and finally say the things I had been too angry and hurt to say when he was alive. So I put on my borrowed black dress, bought those wilted flowers from the gas station, and drove to Millbrook Memorial Cemetery on that gray October morning, planning to say goodbye and then walk away from the Hartwell legacy forever. I had no expectations about inheritance or family reconciliation. I certainly never imagined that Theodore had spent his final months planning one last manipulation that would transform my life in ways I couldn't possibly anticipate. Standing there at the edge of the crowd, ignored by relatives who had written me off years ago, I thought I was attending the funeral of a man who had controlled my life from a distance and then abandoned me to face the consequences of my rebellion alone. I had no idea that his death would reveal the most shocking truth of all, that everything I thought I knew about his motivations, his methods, and his feelings toward me had been completely wrong. When Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat and announced that Theodore had left specific instructions for a letter to be read aloud, I felt a familiar knot of dread in my stomach. Even in death, my grandfather was going to have the last word, probably some final condemnation of my choices or a public reminder of the debt I still owed his estate. The family members shifted uncomfortably as Mr. Pemberton unfolded the letter, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed impatience. My Uncle Reginald checked his watch, clearly eager to move on to the reading of the will and the division of Theodore's assets. My cousin Jared whispered something to Amanda that made her smirk, probably a joke about their grandfather's tendency toward dramatic gestures. But when Mr. Pemberton began reading, his voice steady and clear in the cold October air, the words that emerged were nothing like what anyone had expected. "My dear family," Mr. Pemberton read, "if you are hearing this letter, it means I have passed away and you have gathered to say farewell. I want to use this final opportunity to address something that has weighed heavily on my conscience for many years, the treatment of my granddaughter, Natalie Sullivan." The reaction was immediate and visible. Heads turned to stare at me, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment and confusion. Why was Theodore bringing me into this? Why was he making my presence at his funeral even more awkward than it already was? Mr. Pemberton continued reading. "For the past 6 years, I have been watching Natalie from a distance, observing her character, her choices, and her response to both opportunities and hardships. What I have seen has convinced me that she possesses the qualities that built the Hartwell legacy: integrity, perseverance, and the courage to stand by her principles, even when it costs her dearly." I felt lightheaded. The gathered family members were now staring at me with expressions of shock and growing alarm, as if they could sense where this was heading but couldn't quite believe it. "I am aware that many of you will find my next statement shocking," the letter continued, "but I have made the decision to leave the controlling interest in all 3 Hartwell companies, Hartwell Construction, Pacific Logistics Solutions, and Riverside Real Estate Development, to Natalie Sullivan, effective immediately upon my death." The silence that followed was deafening. My Uncle Reginald's face went from pale to red to purple in the span of seconds. Aunt Lydia gasped audibly and grabbed her husband for support. My cousins looked as if they had been physically struck, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. But Mr. Pemberton wasn't finished. "I know this decision will be met with anger and accusations of favoritism or senility. Let me explain my reasoning. Over the years, I have provided financial support and opportunities to each of my children and grandchildren. Without exception, they have used these advantages to pursue comfortable, mediocre lives. They have taken the easy path whenever possible, relied on family money to solve their problems, and shown little interest in the values that built our family's success." I could see tears of rage forming in my cousin Amanda's eyes, while Jared had clenched his hands into fists. My Uncle Reginald looked like he was preparing to interrupt the reading, but Mr. Pemberton held up a hand and continued. "Natalie, by contrast, has never asked for anything. When I secretly arranged financial assistance for her education, she worked twice as hard as her classmates to prove she deserved the opportunities she was given. When she discovered my involvement and felt manipulated, she walked away from security and comfort rather than compromise her principles. She chose poverty over dependence, struggle over surrender. My legs felt weak. I grabbed the nearest headstone for support as the full implications of what I was hearing began to sink in. Theodore hadn't just left me money, he had left me his entire business empire. The 18 months that Natalie has spent working at the diner, paying off her educational debt, despite my death releasing her from any legal obligation, has been the final test of her character.
She could have declared bankruptcy. She could have fled to another state to avoid the garnishment. She could have come to me, hat in hand, begging for forgiveness and financial relief. Instead, she has worked 12-hour shifts, lived in poverty, and maintained her dignity while honoring her obligations.
Mr. Pemberton paused and looked directly at me before reading the final paragraph. Natalie, you may never forgive me for the manipulative way I tried to guide your life, but I hope you will understand that everything I did was preparation for this moment. The 3 companies I am leaving you are not just businesses, they are a test. If you can transform them into something greater than I ever imagined, if you can run them with the integrity and vision I believe you possess, then you will have proven that the Hartwell legacy is in the right hands. The letter was signed simply, "With love and respect, Theodore Hartwell." The aftermath was immediate chaos. My Uncle Reginald was demanding to see the will, shouting about legal challenges and incompetent legal advice. Aunt Lydia was sobbing dramatically while her husband tried to comfort her. My cousins were hurling accusations and insults, both at me and at Mr. Pemberton, who maintained his professional composure while explaining that the will had been prepared by 3 different law firms to ensure its validity. But I barely heard any of it. I was reeling from the revelation that Theodore had been testing me my entire adult life, not to prove I was unworthy of his attention, but to prove I was worthy of his trust. Every hardship I had endured, every principle I had maintained despite the cost, every choice I had made to preserve my integrity over my comfort, it had all been observed, evaluated, and ultimately rewarded in ways I never could have imagined. The financial details, as Mr. Pemberton explained to me privately after the family had stormed off in rage, were staggering. I now owned 65% of Hartwell Construction, Pacific Logistics Solutions, and Riverside Real Estate Development. The remaining 35% was divided among Theodore's children and grandchildren, ensuring they would receive income from the companies, but preventing them from making major decisions without my approval. More shocking still, Theodore had established a separate trust fund that immediately canceled my educational debt and provided a substantial cash inheritance to help me transition into my new role. The man I thought had abandoned me to face financial ruin alone had actually ensured that my struggles would be temporary and that my principles would ultimately be rewarded in ways I never could have imagined. But perhaps the most overwhelming revelation came when Mr. Pemberton handed me a second envelope marked private for Natalie only. Inside was a shorter letter written in Theodore's own handwriting that contained the words I had never thought I would hear from him. "My dear granddaughter," it began, "I know I was never the grandfather you needed or deserved. I was too proud to admit when I was wrong about your mother's marriage, too stubborn to apologize for cutting you out of our family, and too set in my ways to learn how to show love without trying to control everything around it. But I want you to know that watching you grow into the woman you have become has been the greatest privilege of my life. Your mother would be proud of your strength. Your father would be proud of your integrity, and I am proud to call you my granddaughter and my heir. The companies I am leaving you are profitable and well-managed, but they are also capable of much more than I ever achieved. I believe you have the vision and the values to transform them into something that truly serves the community, rather than just generating wealth for the owners. I believe you can build something that will outlast us all. I hope someday you will forgive an old man for loving you the only way he knew how, and I hope you will use what I am giving you to build the life you choose, not the life I tried to plan for you." It was signed, "With all my love, Grandpa." Standing there in that cemetery, holding the letter that revealed my grandfather's true feelings, I finally understood the difference between manipulation and preparation, between control and guidance, between conditional love and the kind of love that trusts someone enough to let them prove themselves worthy of an extraordinary gift. Theodore hadn't been punishing me for my independence. He had been preparing me to inherit an empire. And now, with his companies, his trust, and his final blessing, I had the opportunity to prove that his faith in me hadn't been misplaced.
That brings me back to this office, 18 months later, where I'm sitting now with Theodore's leather journal open on my desk and the weight of 3 companies resting on my shoulders. The transformation from diner waitress to corporate executive wasn't instantaneous or magical. It required every lesson Theodore had tried to teach me, every principle I had maintained during my darkest moments, and every skill I had developed while thinking I was just trying to survive. The first months were overwhelming in ways I hadn't anticipated. Taking control of Hartwell Construction, Pacific Logistics Solutions, and Riverside Real Estate Development meant learning the intricacies of industries I had only studied in textbooks. I spent 16-hour days in meetings with department heads, reviewing financial reports, and trying to understand the complex relationships between suppliers, contractors, and clients that kept the companies profitable. The family's hostility made everything more complicated. My uncle Reginald challenged the will in court, claiming Theodore had been mentally incompetent when he made his final decisions. The legal battle lasted 6 months and cost both sides hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney fees before the judge ruled that the multiple psychiatric evaluations Theodore had undergone proved his mental fitness at the time of the will's creation.
My cousins were more subtle in their sabotage. Jared, who had worked in middle management at Hartwell Construction, attempted to turn key employees against me by spreading rumors about my inexperience and suggesting that the companies would fail under my leadership. Amanda used her connections in Millbrook social circles to undermine client relationships, hinting that the Hartwell businesses were no longer reliable or professionally managed. But the most challenging obstacle was my own self-doubt. Despite Theodore's faith in my abilities, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was a fraud, that I didn't belong in boardrooms making decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. Every mistake I made, and there were many in those early months, felt like confirmation that my family had been right about my unsuitability for this role. The turning point came during a crisis at Pacific Logistics that could have destroyed the company's reputation and cost us our 3 largest clients. A series of delivery delays caused by poor coordination between our warehouses and transportation teams had resulted in spoiled produce, missed deadlines, and angry customers threatening to terminate their contracts. The crisis meeting included department heads, senior managers, and several clients who were demanding immediate solutions or they would take their business elsewhere. Everyone was talking at once, pointing fingers and proposing expensive quick fixes that might solve the immediate problem, but wouldn't prevent it from happening again. That's when I remembered something Theodore had written in his journal about the difference between managing problems and solving them. Instead of panicking or making promises I couldn't keep, I called for silence and asked each person in the room to explain, in writing, exactly what had gone wrong from their department's perspective. What emerged was a clear picture of systematic communication failures that had been masked by individual departments working around problems instead of addressing them. The warehouse staff had been improvising solutions to inventory tracking issues. The transportation coordinators had been manually adjusting delivery schedules without updating the computer systems. The customer service representatives had been making promises based on outdated information. Instead of firing people or implementing expensive technology upgrades, I restructured the communication protocols between departments and created daily coordination meetings that ensured everyone was working with the same real-time information. The solution cost virtually nothing to implement, but required each department to change established habits and work more collaboratively. Within 3 months, Pacific Logistics had not only resolved the delivery problems, but had actually improved efficiency to the point where we could take on additional clients. More importantly, the employees who had initially been skeptical of my leadership began to see that I wasn't trying to change everything Theodore had built, but rather to evolve it in directions that honored his values while addressing contemporary challenges. The most profound change, however, was in my understanding of what Theodore had really given me. The companies weren't just businesses, they were tools for creating the kind of life and community I wanted to be a part of. The financial security they provided meant I could make decisions based on what was right, rather than what was expedient. The influence they gave me meant I could create opportunities for other people who might otherwise be overlooked or underestimated. I established the Rebecca Sullivan Memorial Scholarship Fund, which provides full college tuition for students from working-class families who demonstrate academic potential but lack financial resources. Unlike the secretive assistance Theodore had provided for me, these scholarships are openly awarded based on merit and need, with no hidden strings or expectations of gratitude. I also created an employee profit-sharing program that distributes 20% of annual profits directly to the workers whose labor generates the company's success. It wasn't just good business. It was a recognition that prosperity should be shared with the people who make it possible. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to recognize and develop potential in people who might not fit traditional corporate molds. When I hired Maria Gonzalez, a single mother who had been working 2 part-time jobs to support her family, as my executive assistant, other managers questioned whether she had the qualifications for such a demanding position. But I had seen her organizational skills, her dedication, and her ability to remain calm under pressure, and I knew that skills could be taught, while character could not. Maria now manages the daily operations of all 3 companies and is working toward her business degree through the evening program at Millbrook Community College. Her success isn't just a testament to her own abilities, it's proof that opportunity and support can transform lives when they're offered to people who have the determination to use them. Looking back now, I understand that Theodore's greatest gift wasn't the companies themselves, but the confidence that comes from knowing you've earned what you have. Every challenge I faced during those 18 months at the diner, every principle I maintained despite the cost, every choice I made to preserve my integrity over my comfort, those experiences gave me the foundation to handle the responsibilities that came with inheriting an empire. The 3 companies are more profitable now than they were under Theodore's leadership. But more importantly, they're also more ethical, more innovative, and more connected to the community they serve. The employees are happier, the clients are more satisfied, and the communities where we operate are stronger because of the decisions we make every day. Theodore was right about one thing. Success without struggle is just privilege, and privilege without responsibility is just selfishness. The hard years I spent proving myself worthy of his trust weren't punishment. They were preparation for the privilege of using wealth and influence to create positive change in the world. I keep his journal in my desk drawer, not as a reminder of the past, but as a guide for the future. The values he tried to teach me, integrity, perseverance, and the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult, are now the foundation of how I run his companies and live my life. And sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing quarterly reports or planning new projects, I imagine him reading over my shoulder, finally proud of the granddaughter who learned to honor his legacy by making it her own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.